Hi, I'm Peter Sanderson from the Poetry Business in Sheffield on Campo Lane. And it's a delight to be introducing these five poets. I found myself saying the other day that they are five in a million. Well, I realised that was too corny to put in any publicity, but still, it's true. There are a lot of people writing poems, and a lot of them are young people and new voices. Though all five of these are quite well published, and Helen Ball, for instance, the first one who will read, worked for 6 years with the Poetry Society in London, and as their education officer, and more recently worked at the Poetry Translation Centre and does lots of different things. But they're here as poets, and although I discovered all of them, I think, through the writing squad, and this is a collaboration in a way with the writing squad. We're not publishing them because they're writing squad poets. We're publishing them because they're extraordinary poets who happen to be. It's not chance exactly, because that is what the writing squad does. It's good at choosing people who are talented, and then as a squad, as a group together, and through various activities and with mentoring, the poets developed. And what is clear from this anthology, that people can get better as writers and still be themselves. These are five very distinct voices. Helen Ball, as you know, has done a lot of things. She might be the eldest, I'm not sure. And her first collection, a pamphlet published by Betty Press, called The Barman, was a Poetry Book Society choice. Purana Kumar, most of the poets are northern. The writing squad is northern, but she's an Indian writer based in London, poor woman. They won the Rebecca Swift Foundation's Women Poet Prize in 2022 and have been published everywhere, including a debut pamphlet, Isiora, which is out from Guillemot Press. They do beautiful books, Guillemot. Eva Lewis, extraordinary writer based in Manchester. They run a magazine called Sync. I think they're at least one other editor. And is an editor for Young Identity, as well as a member of the writing squad and Queer Bodies Poetry Collective. And she's been published in lots of places, including by Broken Sleep. Laura Potts, who we also love and know well, is a writer from West Yorkshire, a recipient of the Foyle Young Poets Award. And her work has been published by Aesthetica, The Moth, and the Poetry Society. She was one of the BBC's New Voices in 2017 and was shortlisted for the Manchester Poetry Prize, which is a lot of money. And I don't think you get anything as a runner-up, but still. And Ruth Yates, who we know best, I think, for various reasons, is a poet based in Sheffield. She's an extraordinary writer. You'll hear all of these people they're very different from each other, but all themselves and all extraordinary. Her poems have been published in Bylines, an anthology of contemporary poets, and I'm delighted to say in Introduction X, the Poetry Business Book of New Poets, which is a collection which again features a lot of writing squad writers. And she's in a very recent issue of our magazine, The North, as well as others such as Pen Out Platform and Route 57. So I hope you will enjoy these readings.
Hi, I'm Helen. Thank you so much to everyone at Poetry Business and Off the Shelf for having me. It's so lovely to be in this wonderful anthology with so many amazing other poets. And yeah, I'm just really, really happy. I'm going to read through the poems of mine that are in the anthology. But first, I know that you've just heard a little introduction to me and my work, but I actually have an updated biog that I haven't sent through. So I'm just going to read that for you now. Short biog. Helen is a medium-sized tree with triangle-shaped leaves from Europe. Her work has appeared in Lancashire bobbins, spools and reels, woodlands, downs and heaths, and is forthcoming in gardens in Lapland. She has provided food and habitat for over 300 insect species and fungi such as fly agaric, woolly milkcap, and chanterelle. Her branches have driven out the spirits of the old year and have symbolized purity, love, and fertility, impregnating many cows. So that's just an introduction to me. I'm going to read the second poem in here, which is also a prose poem. It's called The World's Smallest Ball of Paint, and it's after John Green. This is a very niche reference. It's actually after a video that John Green made on his YouTube channel about the world's largest ball of paint in America. Well, I really liked what he says in that video about basically the world's largest ball of paint starts off as a baseball, and more people paint layers onto it until it becomes the world's largest ball of paint. But obviously, the whole point of that is you paint your layer on and then somebody else paints over you. So you're kind of forgotten by history, but you still contribute to this being a remarkable object, which I really liked. And then I started to write about it. But then, as you'll see, it kind of got a little bit off track. So, the world's smallest ball of paint. I came across the world's smallest ball of paint when driving down the M4 to Bristol on a clear Tuesday morning. The sign for the exit appeared just as I was wondering about my next comfort break, and so I indicated and left the main road. It was exhibited in someone's terraced house, very 50s, patterned wallpaper, all Achille, pillowcases and tea cozies. The lady, her name was Joan, put the kettle on and told me about the world's largest ball of paint in America. Started off a painted baseball, now the size of a barn. And why are Americans obsessed like that? So she'd decided with a few friends to do the opposite. Smallest ball of paint, smallest ball of elastic bands, smallest ball of yarn. The others were in the New Forest in a market town just outside of Lincoln. But here we were, did I want milk and sugar, with the world's smallest ball of paint. That night in the Premier Inn, I dreamt the day over again. Only this time it was the world's smallest ball of pain, and it was being exhibited in my childhood house. I walked with Joan into the living room. Where is it? I said, as she said, they all make that joke, sweetie. It was in the display case facing us, next to photos of the Queen as a young woman and mounted fine china plates. I don't know what to tell you. It was barely there at all. So my next poem is called Ketchup. And I think it was just written in response to a prompt to write about some kind of food stuff. You know, all of the properties of that food, the memories that you might have with it, and even thinking about the linguistic roots of it. And I love ketchup. I'm a saucy girl. I will put it on pretty much everything, and my mum always used to do that growing up. So this is ketchup. Dark red school jumper sauce. Thick, stuck to the bottle's ceiling, made stickier by force. Sweet tang on chips, burgers, toast in Bournemouth breakfast buffets, parents fighting. Egg fried sandwich and sausage sandwich and butter, pasta and in any good spag bowl, non-Newtonian fluid from the Cantonese for tomato sauce. And kind of keeping with the language theme there at the end, my next poem is called Nespera, which is the Portuguese word for a loquat, which I didn't know what that was until my girlfriend told me that it was her favorite fruit. But I guess this poem is about language and about finding words for yourself, I guess. And it's also kind of a love poem. Nespera. I've never eaten one, but you're plucking them from your parents' garden, telling me the tart juice tastes like luck. In my childhood bed, I'm reading about your favorite fruit. Learning the English word loquat is a mistake. A Chinese poet once took them for unripe kumquats, and it stuck. All my life, I've called myself nothing. Scared of learning I'm wrong. When at last I take the fruit between my lips, it's not an apricot nor a peach, but both. You think I am a gold-skinned neshbra, your word, which sounds to my beginner's ears like naushper, like summer's here, don't wait anymore. And my last two poems are actually taken from my pamphlet, The Barman, which came out a couple of years ago with Bad Betty Press. And that pamphlet is all about this relationship between the speaker, who's not given a name, and the barman, who's also not given a name. And it's told backwards through time. So these poems are kind of taken at random places from the pamphlet. One's from near the beginning, so near the end, and one from near the end, so near the beginning. This first poem is after Hieronymus Bosch, and specifically after the Garden of Earthly Delights, which is this incredible triptych, not poem, but piece of art, like a painting. And Hieronymus Bosch is a medieval painter, but he's so surreal. And if you don't know this painting, you need to go and check it out because it's so weird. And I love weird medieval things. And I love feeling like the people, 700, 800 years ago were just as freaky and strange as us. So all of the images in this poem are taken from that painting. There are like birds eating people. There are like giant strawberries. There's like a lot going on. It's endless. So this poem is, if you can go to hell for lust, can I give you this trout for safekeeping? Don't look like that with your hand on my wrist. I am an owl staring at what I have done. Will you hide with me in this tight red cone? Will you carry me on your back when I'm trapped in a clam? Take me into the trees. Place a ball in my mouth with your beak. I am facing the biggest fish of my life. Put a toad on my chest and touch me. Put me in a drum and bang me. Look at that man skating on ice. Oh, barman, I'm trying to make this boat go, but I just don't know how. And the second and my final poem is called Front Crawl, and it's after Emily Berry's poem. She has a couple of poems which really helped to inspire the whole Barman series, really. But she has a couple of poems about this character called the Doctor in her first collection. And in one of them, she goes swimming with the Doctor. So here I go swimming with the barman. And this is one of the first poems that I wrote, and then I just kept going. So thank you for having me. This is Front Crawl. I go swimming with the barman. I consider not wearing goggles so as to appear more sensual and less like a frog, but I can't take the chlorine. I have to do lengths, just a few. Even if the barman minds, he'll get used to it. He assures me he's fine, but I keep looking back down the lane to check. He nearly drowned when he was 15. The river too fast, the ciders too quick. His friend dove in, kickboxed the current, and the water let him go. He says luck didn't come into it. It wasn't so bad. He could have swum out of it. And suddenly, I can't see him. I stop mid-lane, splash to the side, and hoist my slick self out to find him laughing. Good joke. I slide back in and do my very best breaststroke, thinking how the barman couldn't say what luck was to save his life. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Prerna Kumar, and I'm going to be reading from the Poetry Business 5 anthology for you today, and I'm really happy and excited to be reading for you. I'm going to go through 3 of the poems. The first 2 poems are from my pamphlet, Ixora, and they're mostly about family and culture and memory. The first poem is called Legacy Story Drape. The first time I saw Nani drape a sari, Tussar silk shrouding each sorrow, was Mama for her brother's wedding. Afterbirth scars silvering the gauze into thick pleats. A fountain of women line their gums with saffron before worship. It's modest, Nani says, to hide how a body flays in some kinds of light. At least they cease swaying. Legend is that dancer Draupadi, who might have been peeled by 100 swords, was cocooned instead in yards of velvet, woven from a kind god's hands, until he crumpled into her spinning, and then began the first unseaming of her stitch. Isn't this my first full drape at 15? My papa clapping a table as Uncle Ramesh said, "Carve up my wheat body if I look at him wrong." Isn't this a man in England asking what a pleasing skin tone might blush like? Answer purple streak, amber spit, each mudgo color a kind of bruising to hide the darker goats, led to the woods first by ceremonial scarves before their bleating becomes meat water in the air. When asked if I'm north of the Deccan or south of the plateau, I say 4 languages grace my waist tuck. Yesterday I soaked through my bandages and laughed until all my anklets welted in threads. A daughter escaped the coast a story ago in her grandmother's silk. When she dug out that first bow from the base of her neck, she found every family woman muscled there into knots. Backless every night, I pleat my grandmother's leftover body in windows. I tell myself it's for the view, not the fall. The second poem I read for you today is called I Rewind the Second My Mother's Girlhood Breaks. I am below her when it happens. She lets go of the banyan's hanging roots, her body launched into Bulbul's arc on the upswing. So many Ixora blooms clouding through her cheeks. My mouth wants itself a perpetual hole for laughter to cocoon. Please let her rise, let her nest into joy. Let her believe her bones remain bird hollow in this wind that smells of rose milk. Let her hear the grinding of cardamom, a sparrowed lullaby humming the weeds. But here comes the slow fall, her shoulder in fragments which quill straight for the thrumming of her chest. I refuse her inheritance, resent my egoed clavicle, the rasp in its turn. I want selfishly for grace, bitter even when she takes care to play me her cleanest whistling. How she crawls through her father's carpets, whispers Udan 12 times, rubs the small of her back into intimate feathers. How she tucks old quills into the chadar of my forehead, a fresh hatchling throwing its first chirp into her filling mouth. She is sorrowed when she brushes my hair. I tried, but you love me so different in your dreams. And I am treacherous to forget what unravels in the afterbreak. My mama thrown against the sky, cresting in her stubborn laughter. Keep her there. And the last poem I'll read for you is a newer poem, and I wrote it for two of my closest friends. Kali lays down her swords for Fahad and Kim. I've been swinging from the high branch for years, soul lipped with violence. What glaciated in me was a prayer bead fractured mid-prayer, a darkling hymn against my father's hands. Learned love was another cleaving rim, a promise of tender made to a body, neem paste soothed onto a scar, then a blade sunk to the hilt without blinking, that twisted mouth afterward. And I would have stiffened ice in the winter, cursed to feel forever my wound opening against the sharp, too afraid of love to move. But you caught my eye across the meadow, left me offerings palm warmed, sparrow bone, seal tooth, lace wing scooped by the fist, stuck your hands straight in there, unwound the great hurt of my life into a silken lullaby, hummed back to me the small coaxing warmth. Everything you burned to keep me here. Tallow candles shored up for the apocalypse, oil fingered from the necks of heirlooms, cast iron shavings rusted precious over the years. Without asking, everything you burned to see me through the long obsidian of my past, that unrelenting whetstone. I came so bladed until I didn't, until you offered up the dappled orchards of your memory, the cost of heating rising by the week, held up a match and said, "Come, we built you this fire." Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Eva, and I'm lucky enough to be included in this beautiful Five Poets anthology. And I'm going to read some of my poems for you. So the first one is like a series of free erasure poems, which were taken directly from memories, and they're basically just blackout poems of memories that I recorded. There are 3 of these. So I was a holiday park in Wales. My memories forgot to bring teddy bears and sleep, so my sister won both on arcade claw machines. Even machines are fixed. I remember when I took after a day at the beach, being fascinated by her naked riots, and scared because London wasn't answering her phone. I normally charge the vending machine and return with change, but lied to memory, mixed up in all of I, swimming alone in the door. I was cold and raining. I remember free. I am autumn with a hostel, an exhibition of acts like one big skeleton tattoo. Broken taught him how to kill octopuses. We are crossing busy dark matter. Want is suddenly terrified that I'm no. The girl who has beautiful grabs me softly by the hand. Her voice makes me go into art. It is a series of rooms with light and sound insulations. One room choreographed our heads. I felt the floor tightly when she cried. Last night I could turn into an attack. I got performance anxiety and couldn't watch all the people die. A Harley Davidson motorcycle gets stressed and likes to ride really fast over the mountains until the stress fires into orange sunset. This next one is called Broken Yellow Wallpaper. Those days when I would take off, my name lifting from shoulders before PE lessons, folding its white collar in half on the bench for an hour's rampant blood temperature, heart rate elevated without it. Then its little stitches, almost curling off like damp wallpaper. Handiwork of steri-strip precision in my grandmother's needle-pointed eyes. I would scuff it, unsweat-stained, numbly dry, pulling overhead, and live with its little black letters pressing in to the nape of my neck like another thing I can now think of. And final poem is called A Cave Water Shadows. 1. Growth too has a curfew. For example, a dark room descending on its stem, spine bending towards rock bottom. You do not need to say it more than once for cave too to remember. I do not need my mother to repeat, I am a disappointment. I wore a hole in my shoe, and because nothing truly disappears, I wore the inverse of that hole on my heel for 2, 3 weeks. A blister saturated into a dome. It leaked when I popped it, sobbing or drooling. The body, after all, is mostly water. The difference between a tsunami and a beach is the structure, ball, of earth beneath it. What year 7 lesson isn't Sisyphus bound? The mouth spoons each word round as hunger, a boulder. My mother shoulders her way up in my thoughts. Again, ghosts are the same as 5, the boulder. The absence in a cave is what echoes. The wind with a snake's tail in it, rattling through this exposed house. Does the sun identify as 6, a rock, a planet, or somewhere in between light and ash? I identify as Neptune. All those rings like years, 8, around my eyes. Ice and rock that could not be contracted into a planet. I'm orbiting the bad, 9, decisions I made 20 years ago. Insomnia identifies as purple. The sun a welt raised, 10, into a boulder. It is hunger. My mother pushes up to the precipice of my lungs and dangles, 11, her legs thrashing, a child's swing set. I seesaw on the verge of tilted earth. I whirl, 12, up. My mother shouts down to me, the water. My whole body rings from her words, a stream circling a dropped penny. Thank you so much for listening.
Hello, I'm Laura, and I'm going to read a few poems from 5. This is Night Song in memory of Anthony Burgess. Night Song. Birds came in on the tail of the day to the evening bells of Harper Hay. Dusk had smudged the land, the lanes long as sorrow in the graceless rain. He'll remember the hour, the saddening glamour of lamps in the dark, the way the city lit its quiet lights below the stars. And this is home, old as coal, as cotton, old as the throat that a boy broke open there at evensong. Yes, Manchester, the little lights live on. He knew the prayers, the silver songs that lit the sky by night. How time would remember this city, the 1,000 lost tomorrows and the avenues of light. And oh, the human music, the ever bells, the pipes that lifted through the smoke, there held their holy notes. And those bright gods. Over the domes of the dark, he watched the sparrows charm and sparkle into absence, into loss. Holly. In a suitcase, your years at the lit bus stop. Laughing loud and long, the top of your lungs a screaming fox. You had stopped to tell me you were gone. Yesterday a word dark on your lips. Chips I remember we split in the rain. A fizzing last laugh in a childhood lane. Smacking our knees as the trees threw their bats. Again as the street lamps hung in their hats, I remembered we dreamed at the back of a class a lost and dizzy tomorrow. Remember that? Most of those stars left long ago. Holly, the river has forgotten your name. No, your broken light is the same to me, cracked black by the decades we did not see from your garden gloam. That night as I walked the last mile home, a scrap of your laugh clung to the wind, and your bicycle bell, 50 years long, thinned to a song I have heard since then, your afterglow gone. Do you remember the thunder like a great amen? I looked on. Sweet autumn. And years later, you at the bus stop. Yesterday's leaves in your hair. The seat where we laughed. Our words in the air. Sweetheart. The years threaded up our names scratched on the glass. Rain argued away the grass-stained fingerprints. The love turned over on clumsy tongues. The moon bows, the setting suns. My skin soft tossed in sheets, hard kissed. The taste of your words. The clench of my fist in the deafening dawn. O day, when the pavement rolled beneath our feet. Bubblegum from the shop. My Monet mouth. Your Friday chips. Stop. Darling, how we used to crease at the waist. Pink and white laughter poured from our lips. And when I meet you at the curb of my sleep, it is when we were here, my heart in your hands on my dress. They said you spilt your filth down telephone wires for cheap love, sex. I wouldn't know. I walked away. Like this. Yes.
Hi, my name's Ruth. I live in Sheffield. Really happy to be included in this anthology. And many thanks to the Poetry Business and the Writing Squad for making it possible, and also Off the Shelf for organising this event. My great-great-granddad was a funeral director with a real horse and carriage. Apparently he was a gentle soul. I can see him trotting along somewhere in Birmingham, the Coin Exchange perhaps, on his day off, taking the horse out for some not so covert advertising. I wonder if he kept mints in the pocket of his waistcoat. I met him a few years ago at a museum in York. My grandma and great aunt stopped at one of those life-sized figures, a splendid carriage, black horse, a man in a suit stood tall, and my grandma said, he was just like that. School on Saturday. She went to school and let herself into the classroom and started on the Play-Doh, even though the colours were rather grey now, and there was nobody around to notice how she used the cutters to make all the shapes she wanted. She already knew how to tie her shoelaces in a double knot, and she stood the stillest in line, only she didn't realise it wasn't a Saturday, and the classroom was full. All the windows in the classroom looked out onto better things. The next poem is called Doncaster Pride. It's about going to a Pride event in Doncaster, being in the quiet tent, and there's also some references to the 5 tenets of Taekwondo. Taekwondo is a Korean martial art. Doncaster Pride. The security guard sits wearily on a blue-striped deck chair, here till 10 p.m. It's all right, but hasn't even started yet. And a dog barks, a car revs. People layer rainbow upon rainbow in t-shirt, flag, and badge, and the wood pigeon still calls your name. Less mournfully now. It's been a long year and it's only August. And the wood pigeon keeps going, never gives up like one of the 5 tenets of Taekwondo. Consider courtesy, opening the door for others. And integrity, admitting it was the wrong door or the wrong others. Perseverance. The wood pigeon goes on. Self-control, not responding to the provocation of the cat watching the dog next door who is barking until he is sick and his throat has no bark, and she sits and watches calmly, then finally walks away. Indomitable spirit. The poem's called Otter. Otter. I used to swim in Nye Bevan Pool just before Chip. Nicknamed Otter for their ability to stay at the bottom of the pool and crawl along it. Way before their Taekwondo years, this was self-control, perseverance, indomitable spirit. They did want the attention of the bigger lads, who petted Otter and held them on their laps. They made a fuss of Otter, and Otter was the youngest, self-contained. They crawled along the bottom of the water for several years, barely resurfacing, until they realized at some point they needed to act human and put the ways of the otter behind them. They had thought like an otter, spoken like an otter, and perceived things pretty much as an otter. They climbed out of the water, paw after paw, gave themselves a shake, but a paw through their whiskers. No one noticed the change. No one saw Otter, only a little girl climbing out of a swimming pool. And this poem is addressed to Charles Altamont Doyle, who was the father of Arthur Conan Doyle. And he was an illustrator and an artist, and he was committed to what they called a lunatic asylum in the late 19th century. It's also inspired by Joanne Lindbergh's Letters to My Weird Sisters, where she writes letters, long letters to misunderstood historical figures. And there's a quote by Charles Altamont Doyle at the beginning of this poem from 1889 from his diaries. So to Charles Altamont Doyle, what can I do? I would have thought it would be the duty, no less than the pleasure, of refined professional gentlemen to protect men like myself, and not endorse utterly false conceptions of sanity or insanity to the detriment of the life and liberty of a harmless gentleman. Charles Altamont Doyle. Charles, I'm so deeply sorry for what happened to you, and I agree that the Scottish doctors probably misunderstood your sense of humour, and you bewildered them. Or perhaps they felt threatened, or genuinely thought it was for the best in all their Victorian benevolence. But allow me to give you some advice if you want to get out. Only show them your drawings if they are exact representations of what they can see as well. Yes, like this crow sitting on top of the weeping ash. What? They've not seen that either. So what are they looking at? When a man looks for madness, he finds it. Just like when you seek anything, eventually it arrives. A rainbow or a big storm. A horse rearing up or two ravens flying. One with a straw in its beak. Or mud on your shoes that needs to dry before you can get it off. Dear sir, I would love to correspond with you, but I'm 2 centuries late. Please accept my humble apologies and this demonstration of respect for your artistry and your sanity, in no particular order. Yours. Thank you.